Hi everyone, welcome to week 6. Alright, so you've done it, you have made it to what we at Blur would call scene assembly. Okay, thus far you've been creating your environments, you've been sculpting, you've been kind of composing things into shots and getting everything ready. Scene assembly is where oftentimes a file gets handed off at Blur and gets put into the hands of somebody else to final the shot. But before then, as we did last week, the environment artist will compose a bunch of set dress elements, and you'll see these here. We're back looking at my masthead image. They will have composed some set dress elements that the scene assembler can use to move around on a per shot basis as they would see fit. Let's say that we're in this environment and there's multiple cameras in here, so it might be that this might look good for this shot, but on another shot looks like crap. So you would be expected to move that stuff around. The other component of scene assembly is that rendering becomes significantly more important. When we're doing the environments, obviously rendering is important, but we're not considering as much the footprint that this file is going to create on the farm and how it's going to need to be managed. So scene assembly is where we actually start to manage the file. I talked a little bit last week, or quite a bit, about organization of the files, and as of now, I would expect that everybody's got some sort of organization. You've got your cameras, your lightings, you have lighting, or could be multiple lighting scenarios. You have environment, and you have some set dress components and source objects and whatnot. This can be further broken down based on the specifications of your scene and the specifications of the hardware that you have to render on. In the case of this shot, I actually have to break this down beyond what you're seeing here, because this tree alone, this guy with all the flowers and all that stuff, when it goes to render, it's like 24 gig. Okay, then the waterfall, this guy here, he's like another 30 gig just to render. So I only have 48 gig on my machine. So if I try to render this, plus all of the other mesh in here, I page and nothing's going to happen. So at this point, this is when all of you should be considering, okay, if I'm rendering, what's going on and how might I begin to break this up? That's kind of part one, and you'll be expected to break them up as your machine requires. This is not, if you can render your scene in your shot, or your shot, on your machine, and you don't need to break it up, and you're not kind of breaking the bank, then, don't go crazy. This is not an absolute must for everybody. But when you are doing environments like this, this is something that you need to consider. The next thing we're going to talk about is V-Ray and some first pass settings, kind of what we consider to be first pass settings and what we would do. Normally you would be handed off a file that would have some settings in it. It would also have some render elements that I showed you guys last week, this open render elements. This has none of those, but I can quick set them up, and I'll kind of walk through what I would do to break up my own scene. Then on top of that, we'll talk about V-Ray. I have posted for this week the Grant Warwick Intro to V-Ray course. His lesson 1. I recommend all of you watch that, even if you believe yourself to be an avid V-Ray aficionado of sorts. You should check it out. It's got some really good things. Some of it we definitely do at Blur. Other things I would say that our end goals are probably different. So because we're doing animation and Warwick comes from more of a still background, there are things that he's going to talk about in that, as far as like filtering and stuff like that, that he'll turn it off. You'll see in the intro video, and we don't do that. We can't do that. We're working with things in motion and motion blur and compositing in a totally different level. So you will not turn that off. I really wouldn't recommend it. A lot of what he's talking about as far as the image sampler and things like that, and I'll talk about this. Those are very true, and I'll talk more in depth about it, and then I do believe that our first guest artist is going to speak even more about some of this and explain a super awesome tool that he's created to kind of embolden you guys in a totally different way. So stay tuned for that. So I'll walk through all of this, but definitely watch those videos, and it'll give you a good framework for some of what we do, especially with V-Ray 3. Some stuff has changed. Really specifically in the V-Ray camera, you no longer have... let's go over to here. You no longer have camera overrides for motion blur and depth of field, and there's a good reason for that, and as Vlado would explain it, it's basically, if you were overriding on the camera, it was the same as just setting a higher amount here, and it was either or. So if you were saying, like, I want 24 motion blur samples in the camera, it was the same as saying I want a max subdivisions in my AA of 24. Okay? So when you hear me talk about things, this is your AA, and this is the DMC. DMC is composed of your reflection, GI, lighting, what else? There's something else, I'll think of it. And your AA, this is solving for your depth of field, edges, and some of that is going to be your color threshold or noise threshold as well, whichever you choose to use. And did I say depth of field and motion blur? Probably. And I'll get more into those, so forgive me if I'm just being terse. Okay, so that's kind of what we're going to talk about as far as V-Ray and its application at this point. And generally, when we're doing first pass, we are not doing final sampling settings. Say that 3 times fast. All right, so here's our first pass scene. This is your file as you have created it and you have organized it. Now, I have a problem. I have to render this thing, but I've got water and reflective objects and all this, good stuff that I've created some issues for myself. So first, I would break this up into kind of a foreground, midground, background type of organization. So I would recommend that you guys also do that. So I'd create a couple of groups, and if it will rename my groups. Wow. It's a very descriptive name, eForeground. Adding that environment just makes it so much more descriptive. Alright. And learn to spell. Wow. I really wanted to use that E. Alright. So, I'm going to basically replace this, this guy here, but first I'm going to need to, I have this E cliff faces, right? And if I come out here, and if you're using the new onion, then this is so much easier. Alright. So I have this cliff faces, and basically, and you'll see right now they're frozen. As I told you before, freezing these guys is really going to improve your viewport performance, especially when you get into very high-res geo. That rock's pretty awesome. Okay, so I'm going to unfreeze this, and I would basically consider all of this. And you can see this stuff is heavy. It takes a minute for it to grab it. And I'll do a new from selection. I'm going to call this cliff face midground or foreground. Wow. Mesh. And then I'm going to rename this cliff face midground mesh. And then I'll come back into my organize, and I'm going to put this guy, the midground, obviously, you guessed it, in my midground layer, and that guy in my foreground layer. The hero tree, it's going to become its own separate component, and I think that my base environment will go in my midground as well, or in my foreground rather, and that's literally just like a plane for water and an underwater surface as well. So that's going to come with the foreground. Hero tree will be its own element as well. So let's add another group. And I like to make groups for these just because it helps with keeping them organized, and you can kind of clump your foreground elements and midground elements. Hero tree, foreground, grow effects, and what do we have? Base terrain. He's going to go in foreground. So hero tree, bring you down here, and base terrain, bring you into here. Alright, now this guy, we can delete that group. He's now basically useless. Alright, so now our next problem, which is forest pack. Alright, the next thing I'm going to do before I go into this is I'm going to save, and I'm going to save up, and you'll notice that Blur is really where I got this naming convention. I haven't used this previous to working at Blur. This VO1.01 or _01, and this is like to give you multiple levels of iteration, obviously. But one thing I like to do is I will use VO1 once I get into like scene assembly. VO1, that's always my first pass. So everything VO1, that's first pass scene files and renders, everything like that. And then once I get into second pass, then I will iterate up to VO201. And then third pass, which is our last pass, and that's our finaling stage, that will be VO3. So the next 3 weeks, week 6, 7, and 8, we're going to be doing first pass, second pass, third pass, basically. And I'll give you some of the guidelines that we have, and those guidelines can vary from show to show and from supervisor to supervisor. None of this is like set in stone. There's no like Bible. So I'm just going to increment up. Hopefully you can just hit the plus. Because hopefully this doesn't crash it. As I think I've already said, Forest Pack can crash your shit when you copy it. And really what I want to do is I want to copy it. You can see I have this Forest Pack, and if I select the objects on the layer, you'll see I have a Fern Small and Ferns Large, right? But it's only 2 systems doing all of this, and none of it's, you know, super complicated. If you guys have watched all of the videos by now, you'll see like this is just a single surface area, and I think all I've done is, yeah, really just affecting with no limiting here, and yeah, just a lot of surfaces. And where's my distribution map? There it is. Couldn't find it. So just a spread with a decent amount, because it's only a couple of surfaces I'm putting on. There's no reason to really go totally crazy. But what I want to do is I need to make a forest ferns large foreground and a midground. So I'm going to start with my foreground, and then I'm going to copy this as a copy, and I'm going to call that midground. And it's thinking quite a bit. Okay, so the next problem I have, because I was unorganized, is at the time of starting I didn't think like, you know, I'm going to render this whole thing together. Like, nope. So I didn't really care. I had everything organized into layers, but I've got these group, this is, you know, ZBrush naming convention here. So I have some house cleaning that I need to do, and so I need to come into my foreground, and really ultimately, wow, I kind of only need to do it on one. And selected objects, text, full rename, add prefix, foreground. And I'm going to get an error, but it is going to work, which is just bloody awesome. Yep, so now I have foreground group named to each of those. Okay, so now I know what my foreground objects are. That was just, I showed you guys that simple renamer. So again, select objects by layer. Oh, what did I do? I'm turned off. Don't want an override material yet. Select objects by layer. I'm going to grab my foreground guys. And obviously here I want to keep everything that is labeled foreground, so all of this stuff I can delete. Alright, so now I have one foreground guy. So this is Forest Ferns Large foreground. So I'm going to hide that. Then I'm going to select what is presumably the other one. Yep, Forest Large Midground. And I'm going to delete that. So there was only one large fern. The rest of these are the small ferns. And then this is all midground stuff. And if I were diligent, I would name this midground and be a good doobie. But in the interest of time and you guys not having to watch this, you rename everything. We'll just keep it simple. Alright, so again, I'm going to copy Fern Small and name it foreground. Or actually, don't. I'm not going to copy it. I'm going to rename it first. Start with the foreground. Clone it and give it the midground name. going to think. Alright, so then in midground, now I've got these foreground guys. I know I need to get rid of them. And I can hide this. Select my ferns large. Something went awry. Let's just use ferns. Oh, that's my ferns large midground, because I didn't hide that. Alright, so now I've got my foreground, so I'm going to delete all of these guys. And what are you? Ferns large midground. Alright, so that looks correct. We can test this. Alright. So I want my foreground guys. I'm going to create a new layer. Rename this. Well, at this point, ferns, foreground. Come on. And then rename this layer. Okay, so now let's turn that off. Did we get something coming for the ride? Yes, we did. Alright, so maybe the renamer didn't totally work, or maybe I missed a selection or an object. Oh, see, I've missed some objects in my selection. So, bad Chad. And now I'm bringing some new guys along for the ride. Alright. There we go. All is good in the world. Well, not quite yet. Let's bust the tree grunt again. And prefix. We're gonna get like foreground. Yes. Obviously, I would find and replace to get rid of the other ones. Or actually, did it? Oh, smart tree grunt. Good job. Or smart renamer. Good. Okay, so now I need to clean up my other guys. So foreground or midground. Those were the... And really, I've kind of screwed up my stuff here. So I'm going to need to copy my midground ones again. Or let's just figure out what objects they were on. What those objects are. Group 6496. 6 and 95. Obviously, one of them is this, and the other one is... there we go, it did fuck that up. Come on. Okay, so it's these two pieces. And we got Ferns Large. Ferns Large didn't have that in the first place. Okay. Well, apparently it did. I just missed it. All right. And there can be like slight differences when you do this stuff. And again, you know, I've kind of told you, like, don't become too attached to any of this, because this stuff, it doesn't ever do the same thing kind of twice. And that's no big deal. Like, if you really wanted that, you can, on this forest pack, there are these, let's say you like had your heart set in this placement. You can, where is it? Forest Tools. Instantiate. You can convert all of these guys to instances, each one of these. So it would become an instance of itself. Let's say you had made 3 variations, so it would convert this down so that there are 3 variations of those 3 instances that you had originally created in Grow Effects, which is nice, because then you could say, like, alright, well, I'm going to delete all that shit, and I want to keep these guys, like, I absolutely want them placed where I had put them. And if you are using splines and stuff like that, which I'm not, you are more likely to get the exact same result than what I got here. But, at any rate, delete those foreground guys yet again. Alright. So we've got... Alright, so Fern's midground and Fern's foreground. And let's do a little house cleaning again. Add a couple of groups. So what we need are horse pack, set dress, foreground, forest pack, set dress, midground, and ultimately we will have a forest set dress background. So this comes down obviously to there, this comes down obviously to there, right? And I'll move all of these around again once once I'm kind of done cleaning it up. I'm just going to put that on my other monitor. Okay, so that's doing that. So this is a little bit like, and you know, rinse and repeat this process. Let me see how many I have on this weeds guy. There's only one. So obviously rename this foreground, right? Clone it. Call it midground. Save. I was just thinking, Force Pack's doing really well, although it's seeming like it might crash. Okay, and for the midground one, obviously we get rid of all the foreground guys. And then for the foreground one, we get rid of all the midground guys. Yep, what I was doing. Alright, and again, some quick house cleaning. So my Force Pack set dress. Okay, so why am I doing this? Basically, so I can be totally organized when I go to create a bunch of alt properties and alt materials for this, because what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to need to render the foreground, you know, visible, obviously, and then the background, I want that to be, you know, not visible to camera, or perhaps a matte object. In this case, I really don't need it as a matte object. I just need it not visible to camera. I want it to cast shadows and all that stuff for my foreground element, right? And because I know I'm going to layer this, even my midground, well, my midground, I do need my foreground to cut it out, and specifically because of the tree. The tree kind of lives in both worlds, and the tree will be cut out from the foreground forest pack elements, and then it will also sit over the midground forest pack elements. So it'll be like all forest ground or forest pack rocks, or sculpted rocks and forest pack elements rendered, the tree behind that, then and it will be, well, for edge issues you might actually want to not occlude, and I think ultimately what I wound up doing is not occluding the tree from the forest pack stuff and laying the one over the other, because if you start doing like two mini matte objects and not just kind of layering up intelligently, you'll get alpha edging and kind of ringing around geometry where they meet up. So, but basically the reason why I kind of break this stuff all out so kind of radically or distinctly, not that it's anything radical, is that I'm going to create all of these alt properties and then use those as render elements, create foreground render elements, midground render elements, background render elements, so on and so forth. So that's kind of where I'm going with this. I think this is just a foreground component. Petals ultimately will be just a foreground component. so this we've got foreground, we've got on the tree, and then we've got midground, right? So let's see what I have, what I've done. I'm frozen, so. Oh, that fan, sorry. Okay, so this I've been a little bit more diligent as far as naming, although still not the best. Lump bee, leafy bee, flowers. Perhaps these are broken up. We'll see. Easiest way to tell, well, the one I have here, these forest moss flowers, this is all foreground, and I can see over here in the surface. So, new from selection. So if you hear that, that's a fan in the background. I am not sharpening my steak knives, in case you were wondering. Again, all foreground, so add that to that layer. And again, all foreground. I did a good job. Could have named things a little bit better. Would have been just a little bit easier. But this is kind of, something that we do, and normally the lead will kind of go through and do this, but every once in a while in scene assembly you'll have this to deal with. So this is just my tree, so that's obviously going to get rendered with the tree. So real quick, I know I talked about this, but in case you need a refresher, I'm going to talk about kind of what I did to set that up. So there is, in my useful, there is a baked tree, and when I was done making my tree, I wound up baking it down to what you see, and then I scattered or used forest pack up on top of that. Additionally, as I recall, there might have been. You'll see like these little lumpy guys around here, like all this crap. So that's actually like a moss, also kind of mossy stuff, and it's got like a moss texture on it. And then I will additionally forest pack up on top of that sometimes, so that the contours of the forest pack and the contours of the moss and the surface that you're putting them on don't match exactly, because moss doesn't really grow like that. Like, it's not a one-to-one thing. It will kind of sit and clump, and depending on the type of moss, but you'll get these like cool lumps and clusterings of things, and I'm pretty sure that I did. No, these guys are all random. Normally on moss I will cluster, so you get that like area where it's dark and then light, like a light clumping, and then a darker clumping and a light clumping, and that works out really well to help with that. So, oops. And then let's rename this. Back up and let's organize some of this. Okay, so these rocks, I know these are foreground, and so are the petals. They're foreground. This moss is foreground. This guy, did I make a hero tree? Yep. And then midground. Okay, so the other thing that I will do that I didn't do here. Okay, so I like to keep all of this stuff up above. Set those plants. This guy can go away. That's the sources. So generally, I will put my foreground environment first, and then my foreground set dress elements second. And then my midground environment, you guessed it, after that, and midground set dress after that, background environment, which will come, and background set dress. I think that's in one of my other layers or something, or it might not be in this file. I'm not totally sure yet. So then my hero tree, I'll place that just in front of the midground. And say okay. All right. So now I've got my foreground environment, and I know this because I can start to turn things on, and it's just the stuff that I'm seeing for my camera in this shot before the midground kind of comes in and starts to chop things, midground being that, right? So then I'll start to set up my my alt properties, and I might turn everything back on here. And generally, these like set dress guys, I'll freeze them. And you know, these like heavy terrain guys as well. And let's just save. And for some reason, I think that I might have in here, grow effects plants. Ah, yes. Those guys. Those are actually my midground, or my background guys. So let's name them as such. And where did I put you? Okay. All right. So now that I've got all of these, what I want to do. Normally, the other thing is world layer is also your default layer. I think I talked about that, and generally, I don't have anything on that. So let's save up. So I want to start to create some alt properties, and these are alt properties that I pretty much use, I don't know, just about 100% of the time. And the first one is not visible to camera. And the second one is going to be, it's a mat object. It has a negative alpha contribution. And then, oops. Matte reflection, refraction, and GI, because we don't want them to come through in the RGB. And so what you can do is, and let me turn this guy on. I like when I create these, and this is what we do at Blur, it's just kind of smart business. If you right click on this and say copy all to visible, now each one of these has these alt properties, and now when I'm working in, you know, foreground versus midground versus background, I can come in and I can toggle these alt properties on and off and set up render elements that apply to them. So what do I mean? All right, we're going to render the foreground pass, right? And background, honestly, don't need it on. These weeds and all of this stuff, honestly, I mean, it might be that some of this reflects in that ground, or in that water, but really, when you factor in that there's a waterfall and mist and all this stuff, like, this is where it's like, you know your scene, and you know, be diligent about what you need to do. That stuff's just not going to matter, okay? So I would turn that off because it's just going to take up RAM if it's on, and we don't want to do that. So the next thing would be the moss on the tree. Like, you know, we don't need that. It's going to be a minor component, if any, of, you know, this reflecting in here. Now, one thing I did for this was I actually rendered this like this, okay? And I didn't have the hero tree in here. And then I rendered the hero tree, and then I reprojected a separate just reflection pass, because literally I was kind of like running out of RAM on this, and we had just converted to V-Ray 3, and it was having an issue with Frost and with XMesh and a couple of other things that I like to use, and I couldn't get it to render, so I had to do a couple of like little hackery things that normally I wouldn't do. It will now render in this fashion. So what would I do? I would have this, so this midground mesh, I want it to cut it out, and I want it to reflect in here. So I want it to be a matte object, and this, the tree, I don't want it to cut this stuff out, right? I don't want, well, anywhere where these two are interacting, I want those two to interact. So let's say, I think in this particular case, I didn't have plants kind of behind the tree, but if you did, if you had plants kind of going all around, you would also want your hero tree to be a matte object. So now all of this is going to render, but your tree, and hopefully everybody understands these concepts of visible and what is a matte object and how to set these things up. All of what I'm doing is the same, and I know I showed you as, of course all my stuff is frozen. As coming in here and saying V-Ray properties, matte object, -1 alpha, right? That's what I'm doing. I'm just using the onion to toggle all of this stuff. So now I would set up, go to render elements. Well, first, as I showed you before, I'm going to create some outputs. plus E beauty foreground. So E for environment, this is the beauty, and it's the foreground. And, oh, actually, so that's I just like go right into blur convention. I didn't use this for this project. And as I said, you know, actually, one thing, like when I was working on this, because this was like a personal project and it's at home, you'll notice I have gamma on, I have 2.2, I am working with a material editor that is gamma corrected. So, as I told you guys, however you want to work, that's totally cool. What I do at home and what I do at work are often two different things. So, I worked with the V-Ray frame buffer on this, and that's my, no, not that, yeah. I should have just copied this from my file. Alright, and I create a V-Ray image. So I have some render elements active. These render elements are going to be render element, i.e. this render element, specific. Okay, so you can have different passes producing different render elements. But this V-Ray reflection, V-Ray diffuse filter, V-Ray GI, V-Ray lighting, normals, refraction, specular, and Z-depth, I always use those. The reason being is that I can do a full RGB rebuild in Nuke or Fusion or Photoshop if I had to, of any image if I have these components. I will never not write on an image with those. The other things that I will add, though, are my sample rate, and then I will also create some multimaps, as we talked about, and do the where is it? Sample info. So this, I'll do two different things with this. I will do one that's a point, and I will name it point. And then I will do another that is a UV. And where'd you go? Sample info, W. And you simply do that by changing this to UVW coordinates. So what does this do? This basically gives you 3D depth or 3D information inside of your compositing application if you're using something like Nuke or Fusion. You can do volume masking. You can do a whole bunch of like really sophisticated, awesome stuff. The UVs, you can re-UV your objects if you so desired, and place textures on them, do all sorts of cool stuff, add dirt maps inside of your post application that you hadn't added inside of Max, and especially if you completely rebuild the image using these passes and then use new textures in your UVs to kind of hand place them. Basically, it's like Photoshop on steroids at that point. You can do so much cool stuff. So this guy, I would rename that, and generally, I don't know, I'm neurotic. I like to keep these guys kind of at the bottom, either that or at the top. And then the last thing with this is make sure that your depth is not clamped. Not to that. That's huge. And then obviously I'm going to render 32-bit. Point, UV, depth, those are passes that you want 32-bit. It's important that you have them 32-bit. You can scale these, which I just recently learned. I had not done this. Oh, shut up. Where'd it go? I think it's actually just this point multiplier. If you set this to like 0.01 or something like that, It's the same thing as like scaling your entire scene down. And basically that is to compensate for the rounding error that you're going to get the further you move away from origin in your point pass. This is most prevalent when you do a point to position inside of Nuke. You can see like a 32-bit point pass versus 16-bit point pass, and see the rounding error as it just like throws particles out into space on a 16-bit pass versus a 32-bit pass where it's really kind of collecting them and knows what to do with it. So if for some reason you have to use 16-bit and you don't want your stuff to go to null values, which is what it will do, you want to have this point multiplier at a lower number if your scene is just like monstrous. This scene is really held around origin, so I wouldn't likely need to scale this even inside of Fusion if I were using a 16-bit pass or Nuke. Not to say that one of them is going to handle that any better than the other. They are not. Okay, so those are my like main elements, and I will create multiple multimat elements. And you know, not that. And we also, you know, have tools for creating multimats and things like that. So makes this process a little bit easier. But one important thing, I've seen it, and I've seen it recently, unfortunately. The V-Ray raw reflection, V-Ray raw lighting, all of these raw channels, if you want to use them in compositing, they are busted. Like, they don't work, and you'll get funky edge issues, especially around motion blur. If you're using them in animation, do not. They are bad, and you can always get a raw channel just by dividing your lighting versus your diffuse. That will give you a V-Ray raw lighting, or your lighting, or your GI versus your diffuse filter. That will give you a raw GI. You don't need to render them out explicitly, and they do not render out correctly. So that's my 2 cents on that. And that is documented. That's not me making that up. And Vlado apparently cannot. He just can't fix that. So that is the state of the union at the moment. So now I will create a render element. I've given myself these multimats. And, you know, obviously I would go through and object ID these, all that stuff. I'm going to say new. And so this is the problem. Render elements is looking for the V-Ray, or for the max output. And I don't know if you can use this tool with the V-Ray frame buffer, but I'm sure as hell going to try. Is this my foreground? So again, no camera settings, create new render pass. It says, screw you, Chad. So it's probably, because this is a little bit older, it's probably hating on me for doing that stuff in the frame buffer. And it's not the end of the world for something like this. There are some nicer things that you get by using the V-Ray frame buffer as opposed to the max frame buffer, extended metadata or more metadata in your EXRs. For one, the ability to have multiple depths out of a single EXR that you can do with a V-Ray frame buffer. You can't do that rendering out of the max frame buffer. So, projects. No, not Halo. Alright, and then, oh, wait a minute, clear this guy. I'm sure it's going to hate me for the rest of eternity now. And you also have to turn that off just entirely. That's where quick render and using it for to get access to the V-Ray frame buffer. That's one of the reasons why that's kind of been in use. Save. My render elements might be totally busted now at this point. Alright. Let's try again. And I'm guessing that this is bad. Yes, I'm sure. So do it. Yeah, I think I like screwed the pooch here. Let's try to create a new one. Oh, I also am not using, so I'm doing a couple things wrong as far as this stuff is concerned. And I wound up rendering the final of this at work, so I had to do all of this. I'm not at work. And I have this open. Data, camera data add. Thank you so much. Yeah, I really like pissed my onion off. Alright. So I'm gonna save. I'm gonna close this real quick. Well, I'm just gonna start opening a new instance. And yawn. Going to sharpen my knives in the background. Let's see if I can get it to behave. Yep. I'm going off the reservation. Okay, we're back. I can never spell. My tree grunt over there. All right. Now let's see if we can make this behave. Alright, I've got that, I've got that. I do want layer settings. It's interesting what it's like come up with for me. Like, oh, we've got some nice new options for you. Oh, fuck you. Interesting. Did want to work. I bet though. Wonder if it'll do it like it did before. It actually, yes! Let's see if this works. Ah, no. No, I would not. Lame. I think I pissed it off with something set in my file with the VRAY frame buffer. Let's see. Oh, come on. What's your problem? Is it? Not putting the folder. No, you're there. What's your problem? Interesting. Well, hopefully you guys won't have those issues. You know, worst case, if you had to, you could be organized like this and set it up and do your one pass, then set it up the other way, you know, for now once you go to render your foreground stuff or your midground stuff, you're going to want each of these as matte object. So you know, obviously each of these will be matte object, and then this, what I would do for just the rock surfaces, and this is where it's like, alright, well, you actually want the hero tree not visible. I don't want it to cut it out at all because it's going to lay over top of it. And then I also want the waterfall surface. Oh, and I didn't copy that down to here, did I? Yeah, I need to turn all these guys off now because you are old and busted. We're having some serious redraw issues here. Let's switch views. And it's building my surface right now. And it's going to be pissed at me, of course. Come on, wake up. You are. Once you get these errors, it just like spirals. So all of this, it's great when it works. When it doesn't, it kind of ruins your day. Of course, when I go to record this, it's going to not work. The other day it worked, so it is proof that it does work. Just wants to put the kibosh on my tutorial today. I will see if I can get it to work. In the meantime, let's talk. Wow. Let's talk when my other instance of Max gets open, apparently. Yay! die. Hoping I could get in there before it opened. Come on. It's lovely to watch my white screen. Alright, we're back. Okay. So we are left with, let me just delete that other guy. Delete selected. Yes. Go to hell, you go to hell, and you die. Alright. Just gonna save up. I'm gonna try one more time because I'm persistent. Just so we're clear, this is not patience, this is persistence. Still not patient. Come on. Alright. And I'm gonna get that other instance of Max loaded in the background because I don't trust you. Alright. So we've got our mad objects, we've got some render elements set up. Aw, screw you. Basically like hosed all the render elements. Shit. That's lame. And let's see. Diffuse, GI, lighting, normals. Refraction, specular. So that's not clamped. And sample rate. Open this file just in case. And where'd you go? And let's try to, so we have a blur named camera. Not that that matters, but don't be an asshole, you are. Alright, screw you. And it's dead. And it's gone. And I'm using Camtasia. You get the idea though. You should be able to, from that, glean kind of where I was going based off what I showed you last week, and that what you need to do with your file, and what you can start to do. Again, as I said, You don't have to do that if you are not coming up against a memory wall at all. But it is, in general, just good practice. Oh my god. So I think I'm going to pause this here, and I'm going to come back and I'm going to start back up with V-Ray, and I'm going to post this as some more scene organization stuff and give you guys a note so that somebody that perhaps didn't want to watch this an hour and almost 20 minutes of shit crashing doesn't need to. So with that, I will be back.